Okay, so last thing in the fundamental section before we look at a little bit of the construction of the gamma camera, we're looking at what are the important features that radiopharmaceuticals should have. So they should have a physical half-life, which is similar to the examination period that the patient is undergoing, because you want the activity to remain roughly stable for the period in which it's in the patient's body. So an average of a few hours is normal. You want the daughter product to be stable because you don't want a very radioactive product to remain in the patient's body after the examination. You'd prefer decay by isomeric transition or electron capture because you prefer gamma radiation over the emission of particles in the patient's body. You want a low dose from particle decay. So the energy of the emission should be low enough to collimate and detect, but high enough to exit the patient's body. So if the energy of the emission, which is produced by the radiopharmaceutical, is not high enough, it's not going to be able to leave the patient's body. It'll just be absorbed as dose, and it won't make it to the detector. So all you've done is unnecessarily expose the patient to radioactivity, and you haven't even gotten a good image out of it. However, if the radiation is very energetic, it won't be collimated or detected properly. So it needs to have an energy around 50 to 300 kiloelectron volts. We prefer monoenergetic gamma rays because that's more easily picked up by the equipment. The substance should be easily attached to the pharmaceutical, shouldn't have any effect on the pharmaceutical metabolism, and it should be readily available. Another important feature it should have is high specific activity. So that means the activity is high in a small volume, and this makes sure that you only need to inject a small amount of the pharmaceutical. It should be able to localize to the tissues that you're trying to study. It should have a low toxicity and form a stable product in the patient's body and outside as well. Okay, so that's all for the fundamental section. I think these concepts, if they're clear, everything else in the module should be a little easier to understand. So now we'll just look at a few aspects of the construction of the gamma camera. So this part will be mostly descriptive and not so conceptual. So what's happening in the gamma camera is that the patient is injected or ingests the radiopharmaceutical. The radiopharmaceutical goes to the tissue which is being studied and starts producing gamma radiation. That radiation leaves the patient's body and it passes through the gamma camera, and then an image is formed on the monitor. So we'll just study how does that happen. So usually the radiopharmaceutical which is used for this type of imaging is the metastable isomer of technetium with atomic mass of 99. The energy which is produced here is 140 kiloelectron volt, and it has a half-life of around 6 hours. So the components that we're going to be looking at today is the lead shielding, the lead collimator, the scintillation crystals, the light guide, the photomultiplier tubes. We won't be discussing the preamplifiers today. So the collimator itself, as we've said, is a lead disc. So the function of the collimator is to reject. So we can't use a lens to focus gamma photons like we usually do. So we use a collimator instead. So it's going to block the scattered gamma photons. It's also going to be constructed in such a way that we're able to know from where in the patient's body is each photon coming. So if we didn't know where each photon is coming, then we wouldn't be able to construct an image. So that's what the collimator is doing. So it's a disc which is around 25 millimeter thick, 400 millimeter in diameter, has around 20,000 holes, which have again 2.5 millimeter diameter, and they're separated by 0.3 millimeter. And this construction is optimized so that each photon which is picked up, you can pinpoint to where that photon originated in the patient's body. So the collimator attenuates around 90% of the incident photons. So if you have 100 photons which hit the collimator, only 10 photons are going to make it through. So obviously this is going to limit the sensitivity of the camera itself. So once it passes through the collimator, it's being taken to the scintillation crystals. And the scintillation crystals are constructed with sodium iodide, which are activated with thallium. The specifics are that it's around 500 millimeters in diameter, 9 to 12 millimeter thickness. The scintillation crystals will absorb the gamma photons from technetium by the photoelectric process. So when we're talking about photoelectric process, immediately we need to think about what are the important parameters for a substance which is undergoing photoelectric absorption. And most important are absorption number and density. So that's why we're using sodium iodide, because sodium has a really high atomic number, 53. So this scintillation crystal is also going to absorb some of the iodine radiation, which is present as well. So some important things to note about the crystal: it's fragile, it's easily damaged, it's damaged by moisture as well. So it's contained in an aluminum case so that it's not exposed to moisture. So each gamma photon is going to produce 5,000 visible light photons in the scintillator crystals. So the crystals have one transparent face, and all the other faces are coated with titanium. So around these 10 photons, which have managed to make it through the collimator, are going to come into the crystals. They're going to bounce around all of these titanium walls, and a lot of light photons are going to be produced, visible light photons, and then they're going to emerge from the tube. These photons are passed through a light guide, which will safely transport them to the photomultiplier tubes. So the photomultiplier tubes are 91 matched tubes, which are put together in a hexagonal array. They're evacuated glass tubes, and they're coated with a light-absorbing substance. So once these visible light photons are absorbed, they're going to produce electrons, and it's the photocathode which does that. There's a photoemissive substance there. So when a photon strikes the photocathode, an electron is produced. The electron is passed through a focusing grid. So the focusing grid is just a number of electric and magnetic fields which are going to guide the electron through the photomultiplier tube. And all along the tube, there are these stations set up which are called dinodes. So each electron will hit a dynode, and when it hits the dynode, around 4 electrons are produced. And then these 4 electrons will be carried to the next dynode, and then on and on and on until they hit the anode. So 1 electron is emitted per 5 or 10 photons received. And because so each dynode is going to produce 4 electrons for every 1 electron. So after 10 stages, we get 4 power 10 magnification of the number of electrons. So that's around 10 power 6. And then all of those electrons are going to be picked up and turned into the image. So what's happening here is that a photon from the patient's body has gone on a journey. It's become visible light. It's become a lot of electrons. Those electrons are picked up and turned into an image on the screen. And the tube is constructed so that although only a few of the gamma photons are picked up, we can minimize the dose while also getting a really legible image. So one thing about the photomultiplier tube is that it's very sensitive to voltage. So the voltage does need to be stabilized during this process to get a good image. So that's all we have time for today.